In October of 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport on a training flight in a rented Cessna 182L. It was his first time flying at night, and he told people differing stories as to what he was doing that evening. But that's not the mysterious part of what happened to him. About 40 minutes into Fred's flight, he radioed into Melbourne Air Traffic Control to tell them he was being followed by a UFO. 6.5 minutes later, he then told the tower these chilling last words: "It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft." After which, Frederick Valentich vanished without a trace. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the mysterious disappearance of Frederick Valentich, a young pilot from Australia who some investigators think may be the most believable and terrifying case of an alien abduction ever recorded. In the history of missing people, Frederick Valentich is unique. That's because he is one of the only people in history who actually gave a minute-by-minute description of what was happening in the moments right before he vanished. To UFO true believers, his disappearance is also considered some of the best evidence that aliens are real. Frederick Valentich was born on June 9, 1958. Back in 1978, he was living with his parents in an area of Melbourne, Australia called Avondale Heights. His parents, Alberta and Guido, emigrated to Australia back in the 1950s. Fred was their first child, followed by a younger brother Richard and twin sisters. When Fred was growing up, he was never the best student. But by the time he was 20, he had made up his mind what he wanted to do with his life. Fred loved flying, and he desperately wanted to become a commercial airline pilot. He spent years learning to fly, studying for flight exams and logging 150 hours in the cockpit. By that point in his life, he had earned his Class 4 instrument rating, which meant he was allowed to fly solo, but he also had to maintain regular contact with ground control. On Friday, October 20th, Fred stopped by his girlfriend Rhonda Rushton's house after work. The couple had been dating for nearly 6 months. Fred appeared to be pretty serious about Rhonda. He'd even given her a friendship ring to show her he meant business. They had made plans for the following night, but upon Fred's arrival, it immediately became clear that Fred had forgotten those plans. Fred apologized profusely to Rhonda, saying that he'd already made other plans to take a flight the following evening to nearby King Island, where he was supposed to pick up a load of crayfish. King Island was just a short trip southwest of Melbourne. It was maybe an hour to an hour and a half trip from Melbourne to the island. Rhonda was disappointed that Fred forgot their plans, but at the same time, she didn't want to show it. She knew how much flying meant to Fred, and she tried to remain supportive. She told him it was no big deal and that they could spend time together after he got back from his flight. Only Fred never returned. Fred spent the next day at his job as a shop assistant at the Army Disposals firm. From there, he drove straight to his commercial pilot's class at Moorabbin Airport, which ran till 5 p.m. After class, he submitted his flight plan, as he was required to do. The plan Fred submitted stated that he was going to take a rented Cessna 182L on a 1-hour flight to King Island. But here's where things start to get a little weird about Fred's story. That's because even though he told Rhonda and his father Guido that he was picking up crayfish on the island, his flight plan stated that he was picking up passengers, then returning to Moorabbin. No mention was made who these passengers were, although witnesses say that Fred claimed to be picking up some friends. Fred had made this flight before, but never as late as this. Since he was taking off after 6 p.m., this meant that he would be flying at night. This would be his first attempt at night flying. Fred had never been particularly crazy about making this run before. He wasn't the strongest swimmer, and he didn't like flying over the water. The Cessna was fueled up and ready to take off at 6:19 p.m. Before Fred left, he grabbed 4 life vests and put them on the plane, which wouldn't be unusual if he really were picking up passengers. As Fred took off, he checked in with Flight Service Officer Steve Roby over the radio. 40 minutes later, at 7 p.m., he was right on schedule as he passed over Cape Otway. Fred was flying below 5,000 feet and the sky was clear. He turned the plane towards King Island on a flight path that took him over the Bass Strait. the stretch of water that divides Australia's southern coast from the island of Tasmania. Under normal circumstances, Fred wouldn't speak to air traffic control again until his expected landing at approximately 7:28 p.m. But then things took a turn for the bizarre. At 7:06 p.m., just 6 minutes after Fred headed out over the water, he radioed into the Melbourne Flight Service and told Steve Roby that he could see some sort of large aircraft with 4 bright lights zipping close by. Fred said the aircraft flew right by over his head, then shot out of sight. Then it came back and did it again. Ground control checked the radar and there weren't any other planes in the sky. So of course the next question they asked is what this other aircraft looked like. Fred's response was brief. He said that it was big and long and had 4 lights arranged in a rectangle, sort of like landing lights. He later mentioned another greenish light on the craft, although he never said exactly where that greenish light appeared on it. Fred asked if whatever he was looking at was sent by the Air Force, which only puzzled Roby even more. Roby later confirmed that Valentich sounded nervous during their brief conversation. But at the same time, he didn't sound completely scared out of his wits either. Fred told him that he could see the object again, and this time it was coming straight for him. Fred said it swooped right over his plane, then did it again. He told Roby that he felt as if the other pilot was playing games with him. By this point, Roby was completely dumbfounded. There was really nothing he could do to help Fred other than to talk to him and record what was going on. He asked Fred what he wanted to do. Fred said he planned on continuing on his intended flight path to King Island. 6.5 minutes into their conversation, Roby asked Fred if he could tell what kind of aircraft it was. Then Fred replied that the aircraft was hovering over top of him. After which he ended with his infamous last words, "It's not an aircraft." What's even more disturbing is that this was followed by a burst of static and 17 seconds of what is described as a metallic clicking noise. This has led some investigators to speculate that whatever the object was Fred Valentich witnessed in the sky that night, his Cessna may have collided with it. After those 17 seconds were up, Fred's radio went silent, and neither Fred Valentich nor his plane were ever seen again. Keep in mind that in order for Fred's radio to have kept broadcasting for those 17 seconds, it meant that Fred had to have intentionally kept his finger on the microphone button that entire time. Which tells us 2 things. One, that Fred didn't immediately crash when he stopped talking. Otherwise, ground control would have heard the sound of the crash over the radio. It also tells us that something happened to him that night that distracted him long enough to stop speaking, but still kept his radio channel open. After Fred went silent, Steve Roby took immediate action. He put out an alert about a pilot in distress. Fred should have landed at King Island at 7:28 p.m., but the Cessna never arrived at its destination. By 8 p.m., search planes were in the air looking for signs of a plane crash. One flight officer noted in his report that the weather was clear and visibility was perfect that night. The lights along the coast at Cape Otway were visible for miles. This included the flashing beam from a nearby lighthouse, which meant if there were any wreckage in the water, it should have been clearly visible. But no one saw anything. You also have to consider that the Bass Strait is actually a busy location for both planes and ships. There's always a bunch of commercial traffic between the Australian mainland, Tasmania, and King Island. The Federal Transport Department notified everyone in the area to be on the lookout for a downed Cessna, but no one reported anything. Something else that's strange about this is that parts of the Cessna are designed to be buoyant. Even if the plane took a nosedive straight to the bottom of the ocean, they would have expected to find some wreckage floating to the surface. But nothing was ever found. Fred's father, Guido, was up late that night, waiting for Fred to return home. Around midnight, he heard a report over the radio that a plane had gone missing. He was immediately worried that this was his son. It wasn't long after that when his worst fears were confirmed. There came a knock at the front door. The 2 police officers standing there told him that Fred's plane had gone missing. Guido felt his knees go weak. He had to break the news to Fred's mother, Alberta. Fred's girlfriend, Rhonda, didn't get official confirmation about Fred's disappearance till early the following morning, when she saw the local news reports about the missing Cessna. A massive air, sea, and land search took place over the next 4 days. Several ships and a surveillance plane scoured the ocean throughout the area where Fred would have been flying. There was an oil slick found, but lab tests determined it didn't come from a plane. Investigators from the Department of Transport began digging into Fred's personal life to see if there was any chance he could have been involved in anything that would explain his disappearance. But as soon as the strange circumstances surrounding Fred's disappearance hit the news, a lot of UFO investigators perked up and became interested. By October 23rd, Fred Valentich's disappearance had turned into international news. Most of the news coverage that followed focused on the possibility that Fred may have been abducted by aliens. Within days, witnesses began to come forward, adding fuel to the fire with claims they too saw something strange in the sky that night. One witness called into Australia's Department of Transportation claiming they saw some strange lights in the sky at 6:55 p.m. on the night of October 21st. That's about 10 minutes before Fred made his final radio transmission to ground control. According to the unidentified witness, he said he was headed out of a Melbourne suburb called Mount Waverley, driving south toward the Bass Strait. That was when he saw something he described as a scintillation. He said that he saw approximately 30 bright lights falling from the sky like rain, each of which had its own exhaust trail. At first, the witness said he thought it was a meteor shower, but after he heard the details of Fred's disappearance, he began to rethink what it was he saw. The official records don't include the man's real name because he said he didn't believe in UFOs and didn't want to be labeled as a nut. But he's not the only person to phone in a UFO sighting that night. That same evening, a man named John Snow was driving with his family to Barwon Heads, a little coastal town near Bass Strait. At approximately 11:45 p.m., about 4 hours after Fred vanished, John's 11-year-old son saw a pale green light zip across the sky. Keep in mind, Snow didn't personally claim he saw anything, just his kid. But Snow still thought the sighting was credible enough that he should report it. Another unidentified eyewitness told the TV show Unsolved Mysteries that at about the same time Fred would have been flying overhead, he looked up and saw a long green light about 1,000 to 2,000 feet flying above a small plane that we can only presume was Fred's Cessna. The witness said that they saw this green light get closer and closer to the plane. It came down at a 45-degree angle so rapidly that the witness remarked to the people he was with that he thought they were going to crash. The witness didn't say he actually saw the plane and the strange light collide, though. About 6 weeks after Fred Valentich disappeared, an amateur photographer named Roy Manifold came forward claiming to have photographic evidence of something strange that he captured in the sky over Cape Otway that very same evening. At the time of Fred's flight, Roy Manifold had set up his camera to photograph the sunset at a location on the Cape that would have been almost directly beneath Fred's flight path. Manifold set his camera to automatic exposure and took 6 photographs of the sun setting. The photographer said he personally didn't see anything strange in the sky that evening. But after he walked back to his shed to develop his film, his son Jason said that he recalled hearing an airplane noise overhead. But that noise abruptly ceased. Jason said he remembered scanning the sky for the plane but didn't see it anywhere. After Roy developed his photos, one of them stood out, because he had captured something that looked like an actual physical object in one of the images. In the upper right corner of one of Roy's photos was some sort of dark, blurry object. At first he thought he must have messed things up somehow. But then, when he learned that this was the same night when Fred Valentich disappeared, began to wonder if he really had caught something else on film. Manifold's film was sent to an Australian photo lab and determined that the blemish wasn't created by either dirt or damage to the negative, which led them to conclude it actually was a real object in the photo. The negative was later sent to the U.S. for computer analysis by a group of UFO researchers. They claimed that the spot on the image showed a large metallic object. They even pointed out what they say is a cloud of exhaust about a mile away from the camera. However, later analyses by other experts say the spot on the image was most likely a simple developing error. Some skeptics have offered some more mundane explanations, such as the dark spot on the image being a moth or a bird in the sky. In the weeks following Fred's disappearance, the number of people throughout South Australia reporting strange lights in the sky increased dramatically. But at the same time, this could simply be explained away by the population being suddenly on edge because of all the UFO mania surrounding Fred's disappearance. Something else you should know is that Fred wasn't the first person to disappear in that particular area of the Bass Strait, not by a long shot. In fact, so many planes and ships have disappeared in that particular stretch of water around South Australia that the area is sometimes referred to as the Bass Strait Triangle, which is of course in reference to its more infamous cousin, the Bermuda Triangle. In 1858, the British warship, the HMS Sappho, disappeared in those waters along with 100 crewmen. No wreckage was ever found. In November 1920, a schooner, the SS Amelia J, vanished without a trace. Then one of the search and rescue ships they sent out to look for the Amelia J also vanished, as did a military plane they sent out after. Although the rescue ship's wreckage was eventually found, they never found any trace of the rescue plane either. On the night of October 19, 1934, the Miss Hobart, a 4-engine plane carrying 12 passengers, vanished in the same region under circumstances that bear some eerie parallels to the disappearance of Fred Valentich. Locals said they remembered hearing the Miss Hobart flying overhead when suddenly all the engine noises just stopped. It's possible one or two of the engines might have quit, but it's something quite out of the ordinary for all 4 engines to stop at the same time. According to some online rumors, some eyewitnesses later claimed to have seen a second craft in the air moments before the Miss Hobart vanished. Also, like Fred Valentich's disappearance, the flight crew of the Miss Hobart is supposed to have radioed in moments before all contact was lost. Despite the number of UFO reports that came in that night, most official investigators looked to more earthly explanations for what happened to Fred. And although none of them ever came up with a conclusive explanation as to what happened to Fred Valentich, some of them did point to the basic fact that Fred was a relatively inexperienced pilot with only about 150 hours of flight time. He did have his private pilot's license with a Class 4 instrument rating, which meant he could operate a plane at night, but only in clear visual meteorological conditions. Fred desperately wanted his commercial pilot license, or CPL for short, but he failed his CPL exams twice, along with a few other flight exams as well. Some investigators believe that Fred's ambitions may have outweighed his abilities as a pilot. He really wanted to get a good job as an airline pilot. He joined the Royal Australian Air Force as a cadet in the Air Training Corps. A couple years later, he applied for a position with them as a radio operator. But Fred was rejected twice from joining the military because of low test scores. Despite this, he continued to work with the RAAF as a volunteer until they finally took him on as an airman. It should be noted as well that just 3 months before he disappeared, Fred had 3 questionable incidents while flying. Once, he received a warning for flying his plane into restricted airspace. Then on 2 other occasions, he was cited for flying directly into some clouds. In fact, it's because of those last couple incidents that state prosecutors were considering filing charges against him. Now, this all sounds pretty bad. You have an inexperienced pilot flying for his first time at night over the ocean, all of which leads to some pretty obvious conclusions about what happened to Fred. And yet, there might be more to the story as well. For one thing, people who actually knew Fred, including his own flight tutor, thought Fred was a good student who took flying very seriously. His tutor actually believed Fred had the right stuff to become a commercial airline pilot. Fred took Rhonda up in the air on several occasions, and she told investigators that Fred seemed confident and was good at flying. Ultimately, the Department of Transport left the cause for Fred's disappearance listed as undetermined. They did conclude, though, that based on the lack of wreckage, it's unlikely Fred crashed. The official report actually gave some indication the investigators thought that Fred might have orchestrated an elaborate hoax in order to deliberately vanish. The investigators also indicate that they believe Fred made up the story about seeing a UFO. And you really do have to wonder what Fred was up to that night. Remember, Fred told his father and girlfriend that he was flying to King Island to pick up crayfish, while the flight plan he submitted said he was picking up passengers. But as far as anyone could tell, neither of these stories was true. But if both these things were a lie, then what the heck was Fred doing that night? Fred also never even radioed the airport to have them turn the runway lights on, even though we knew it would be dark by the time he was ready to land. We do have to consider the possibility then that Fred might not have ever intended to land at King Island. The official report speculates about the possibility that Fred may have grown depressed and wanted to permanently disappear because of the repeated failures he'd suffered, either by committing suicide or running off to start a new life somewhere. But if that was Fred's plan, then you have to wonder, why would he go to all this trouble? In 2013, Fred's younger brother Richard gave an interview in which he pointed out that there are much easier ways for a person to disappear than to rent a plane and stage a UFO abduction mid-flight. When you research the story, you'll often find reports claiming that Fred was obsessed with UFOs. According to some reports, he had just seen the Steven Spielberg movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind a few months earlier, which only further fueled his obsession. Just a few days after Fred's disappearance, his father Guido told investigators that his son was an ardent believer in UFOs, and he'd been reading about them for years. According to Guido, Fred said in the weeks leading up to his disappearance he had grown increasingly worried about a UFO attack. Fred's girlfriend Rhonda and others who knew him claimed this was overblown by the media, and that Fred wasn't any more interested in UFOs than the next person. One friend of Fred's from the Air Training Corps said the two of them did discuss UFOs once, but it didn't sound to him like Fred was obsessed with them, just mildly interested. But at the same time, one person who was clearly obsessed with aliens was Fred's father Guido. He held firm to his belief to his dying day that his son was still out there, and that he'd been abducted by aliens. Even Fred's own mother claimed she saw a UFO just 8 months before Fred vanished. If we are to believe that Fred himself was similarly obsessed with UFOs, it's easy to see where he got it from then. One of the prevailing theories goes that Fred actually staged his disappearance either to commit suicide or in order to promote the idea that he was kidnapped by aliens. But Fred's family and friends all insist Fred was far too happy of a person to have ever taken his own life. And again, I have to point out that if this was his plan to end it all, there were a lot simpler ways he could have accomplished it. Still, other theories state that Fred may have been trying to stage an alien abduction, only he lost control of his plane and crashed into the ocean instead. Or perhaps ditching the plane in the ocean was part of the plan all along. Remember, Fred did bring along 4 life vests. Another theory that's been put forth suggests that Fred may have accidentally become disoriented and begun flying the Cessna upside down, and that the lights he saw were just reflections of his own airplane lights on the water. And this theory might check out in some ways. Consider that while Fred was talking to ground control, he told them that his engine was sputtering. If a Cessna flies upside down, fuel can't get to the engine and would cause it to stall. I don't know though. I'm not a pilot, but the idea that Fred may have been flying upside down and didn't realize it just seems like a real stretch to me. If Fred really was flying upside down, you'd think he would have noticed because of everything from the floor mats to the change in his pockets falling onto the plane's ceiling around him. One related alternate theory that was put forth in an article from the Skeptical Inquirer, written by investigators Joe Nickel and James Magaha, suggests that the lights Fred saw in the sky that night might have actually been 4 celestial bodies, namely Venus, Mars, Mercury, and the star Antares, which appeared to be in a squarish formation that evening. Fred could have been so keyed up to see alien visitors that he imagined these 4 lights in the sky to be part of a spacecraft. From there, the authors suggest that Fred became so focused on what he thought was a real UFO encounter that he accidentally sent the plane into a so-called graveyard spiral, crashing into the ocean. Whereas to this day, no official signs of wreckage from Fred's plane has ever been found. In 1983, a piece of an airplane called an engine cowl flap washed up on shore on Flinders Island, just east of King Island. The airplane part was identified as coming from a Cessna, and although the serial number was too damaged to read the entire thing, the part they were able to make out did fall within the range of some of the numbers that would have been on Fred's plane. This is really far from conclusive, though. It's true that pilot error leading to a crash in the ocean certainly makes more sense than a deliberate prank or even a so-called pseudocide, the current term for faking one's own death. But if Fred Valentich really did crash into the ocean, then why wasn't any more wreckage found? There were even a few unconfirmed reports claiming that evening that some witnesses in Melbourne saw a small plane land safely in a field, although those reports remain unconfirmed and no one has ever claimed the plane they saw was a Cessna. The idea that Fred Valentich encountered a UFO is certainly the most tantalizing of all the theories, but like all the theories I've mentioned here, there's just no solid proof of it either. In 2014, a UFO action group from Victoria claimed they'd learned of a farmer who witnessed a gigantic 30-meter flying saucer hovering over his farm the morning after Fred Valentich went missing. What's especially chilling about this report, though, is that the farmer claimed that he saw a small Cessna plane actually stuck to the side of the UFO leaking oil. The farmer claimed the spaceship was low enough to the ground that he was actually able to read the plane's registration number. The problem with this story is that the Victoria UFO group was never able to identify this farmer by name. And as far as I can tell, much like Fred Valentich, they never found him either. So what do you think happened to Fred Valentich? Leave me a comment below telling me your theory where you think he vanished to. Also, let me know if you have any episode suggestions or anything you'd like to see going forward. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and watching this video. I hope you'll subscribe and smash the like and bell icons while you're at it. Thanks again.